everybody, for joining us again. We've got a special guest for you today. ESPN contributor, author, political thinker, in my opinion, or personally, one of the intellectual minds that I sort of look to sort of shape and give me a context for certain things. The incomparable Howard Bryant, author of Full Dissidence and The Heritage, both two powerful books I suggest folks check out. We thank you for joining us today, Howard.
Thank you for having me. And I was going to say, even though I'm in Massachusetts, I think everyone should watch anyway, even that Yankee hat on. I don't mind. I have no problem with it.
Right.
New Englanders around here might be like, what is that?
Right. I got
He wears it every episode.
Right.
Well, I'm loving it. The new book I'm working on right now is a biography on Rickey Henderson. So I'm writing about those Yankee years right now. So I'm looking at Billy Martin and Reggie and Winfield and all those dudes. So it's been a lot of fun.
Hey, Winfield. He lived in Teaneck, where I grew up.
I was going to say, all those guys are up there. Teaneck and what's the town right over? Fort Lee? That's where all the Yankees
Fort Lee. Yeah. Fort Lee. Yeah.
So Howard, you've done, as David mentioned, a couple of really interesting books: The Heritage, Full Dissidence. You know, I always look to you as one of the better writers and thinkers around shaping the treatment of Black athletes in the United States, both presently and historically. In particular, let's maybe start with college sports and how, in your opinion, universities have been able to basically build a business mostly on the backs of Black athletes. Yeah,
I think one of the big things that we really don't talk about, and obviously David can speak to this from personal experience, that this pathway that we had talked about for years, for decades actually, you know, of Black integration into the mainstream really does start with sports. And when you go back and if you're looking at University of Alabama in the 60s not integrating, if you look at a lot of those, University of Kentucky, you look at the schools down there that really didn't want to integrate, the pathway to get your doctors and your lawyers and your journalists and everybody else really came first through having Black athletes on campus. And that story, to me, we've lost it. Because we've lost it simply because the money in the game has gotten so big. In a lot of ways, we've forgotten why the athletes are there in the first place. And with the place that we're in right now, I've been asking the question. Obviously, you guys are right in the center of this about whether to pay or not pay athletes. And I remember thinking, I think what really hit me when I was working on the Heritage was there was an NCAA game. It was West Virginia. I don't remember who they were playing. And one of the announcers had said something like that: West Virginia is the most traveled school in the tournament. They've traveled 37,000 miles this season. And I'm like, 37,000 miles?
Yeah, I remember that.
Like, when did y'all go to school? You're actually getting an education here. And then on top of that, there was a 30 for 30. And they were talking about, was it the US? No, it was the XFL. And it was all about trying to get that league going. And so many of the players were talking about getting the phone call that they were going to do, be part of this new league. And each one of them came from big time D1 schools. And a lot of them were Black players. And they were talking about how they wanted this second chance to play. And that this guy was working at Lowe's, and this guy was working at Sears, and this guy was working at the Home Depot when the phone rang. And I'm thinking, where's your education? Where's, so you blew your knee out in your work and you're stacking shelves at Lowe's. And I'm thinking, wait a minute, I don't know that many people on my side of the world who went to those schools when I was at Temple and went to those schools who have that trajectory. And I was thinking to myself, I'm like, wait a minute, excuse me, there's an arc here that we've completely lost. Right. And it was really important to start to dive into that, to look at, okay, on the one hand, you start thinking, all right, if this is what we are, if this is a surrender, then absolutely you need to compensate players. But even if you do that, you still have to think about the fact that the NCAA has completely lost the entire educational mission that should be a component of this as well.
What role should they play in actively making sure that these players get some form of a proper education?
Yeah, actually, I don't know the answer to that because it's an answer within an answer. Because one of the things is that you're thinking about preparation, right? It reminds me back when I was working on, and when I was covering baseball, working on PEDs in the 2000s, in the late 90s. And I remember talking to Dick Pound over at WADA, and we were talking about cycling and swimming. And he was saying, you know, one of the big questions that we have in the anti-doping community is, do you want a clean race or do you want a fast race? That was question number one. And so now when we go back to this question, David, I think how many of these athletes that you're bringing in could handle the coursework anyway? So do you want, you know, so it really does go back to preparation in high school and you know, the skill set and the educational set that a lot of the athletes are coming into in the first place when they get to the university level. I mean, nothing the school can do for you once you get there if you're not prepared for it. But at the same time, if you can ball, then that's why you're there. That's why this conundrum is so powerful, and that's why it's not easy. But obviously, I mean, I think to me, when I think about it, I go down 2 levels. I go down to what education are you getting before you walk in the door? And if we're going to conclude, as the NCAA concludes, that they can have a system where they don't have to compensate the player, and they're not going to recognize that the player is here to provide revenue for the university, then they do have an enormous responsibility to educate and prepare the players.
As of right now, it's structured that college athletes are capped at a cost of attendance scholarship. Mm-hmm. And, you know, I get really, really frustrated when people say that they're getting a free education because that's not the case. If you have to do something to get something, it's not free. And so in the context of college athletics, though, if the exchange of goods for that athlete to provide their services is a scholarship and that's all they get, then wouldn't the university have a responsibility to make sure that that's a proper exchange? Because as a college athlete, you know, certain classes, certain majors, the moment that you're an athlete, you no longer get access to them.
That's right. That's right. And on top of that, not just the proper access and the proper framework of it, but also to stop calling it 4 free years. They're 1-year renewables. And so when you start talking about educating the public on what you're actually getting, the university system, the NCAA, they profit from this ignorance. They profit from people thinking, oh, well, it's all free once you walk in the door. I tell professional athletes all the time, you guys work way harder than we do. You have less security than we do. You do everything more than we do. And there's not somebody right behind me trying to take everything I have on a daily basis. So you start attaching the word free to the athlete, there are so many different layers that come with that, and so many different elements that we're really talking about. We're talking about resentment. We're talking about racism. We're talking about lack of professional respect. We're talking about all of these different things tied into a financial system. And the biggest problem that I see with that, to your point, Ricky, is yes, the NCAA as a system is profiting, and it's to their advantage to not have any of these conversations. It's so important to me whenever I talk to people, and I think college is even more pronounced than the pros because people feel a personal connection to their universities. I mean, when we were dealing with the second mile stuff, I mean, the fact that people were so tied to Penn State, they were blinded by what was actually happening. Right. And you talk about your school, you know, there's a connection to your college, you know, to your university as your alma mater. So the first thing we have to do is essentially what you guys are doing right now is to really break down all of the hypocrisies that are taking place so you can start with an honest foundation. You can't even have a conversation if the foundation isn't honest.
Yeah, and I think we've talked about this in previous episodes, but something that people are either uncomfortable to discuss or are willfully ignorant about is the racial component of college athletics, especially as it relates to the revenue generating sports. College football, you're looking at somewhere around 54 to 55% of the scholarship athletes are Black. If you're looking at men's basketball, it's closer to 57 to 58%. Mm-hmm. And then when you look at starters versus non-starters, the disparity becomes even greater, where now you're looking at 80 to 90% in some cases.
Mm-hmm.
So again, in covering sports, as long as you have, and in telling some of these stories, is it a lack of comfort in just willing to discuss it, or is it willful ignorance?
Well, I mean, I think that it depends on who we're talking to. I think that, or who we're talking about. I think at ESPN, and I think at our level journalistically, whether you're talking when I was at the Washington Post or whether you're talking about being at ESPN, the value systems are different, the dynamics are different, because obviously one is a newspaper but rights holder. I think that it depends on your mission. And I think that if your mission, I mean, let's just say it, my problem with where we are right now is I don't think that our mission is to give the Black athlete a voice. I think the mission is to have Black athletes in particular, but specifically Black athletes because of where African Americans are in the country politically and sociologically. The goal is to have them shut up and play. The goal is not to create a rounded citizen. The goal is not to hear from a rounded, complete citizen. We don't need that, because then, I mean, that's the reason why in my book, Full Dissidence, the first sentence is to be Black is to be a dissident. And the reason is that once you start talking about these issues, now it's not fun anymore. Now, all of a sudden, your fun and games and your entertainment are being intruded upon by the realities of the people that you're paying to see.
Right.
And do we care about their reality? Do we as journalists care about their reality? Or do we care about the final score and going downstairs and interviewing guys and then going back upstairs, and eating, lousy food in the press box? So, I mean, I think that what we're really talking about is the motivation on the part of the people who are supposed to be the conduits, which is us. And I found over the course of my career, and I think it's getting worse, that the athlete is here to entertain us. And the athlete is here to entertain the fans. And the point, one of the points that I've been trying to make for the last several years now is to say, why is the athlete, especially the Black athlete's position, so offensive? Why is it so dangerous? Why is it so problematic? Why is it so risky? And this is the reason, because once you have an educated workforce, and once you have a workforce that is actually able and willing to unravel this entire industry and all of its contradictions, now you've got a different conversation, and you've got to face things that people don't want to face. And so I think that, to answer the question, I really believe that we have a responsibility as journalists that we fail miserably quite constantly. And then also, I think the political, and of course, when you start adding the money to it, do you want to hear from the people that you're paying to watch? And I think a lot of times the answer is no.
Right. I personally will interject a little bit here. I experienced this a little bit in Indiana when, during the Donald Sterling thing,
Mm-hmm.
I was one of the first guys to jump out there because, the way I found out about that whole situation was, really random. I was in the locker room. Reporter Candace Buckner, I believe her name was. Candace came up to me, like, kind of mentioned it to me, and I'm like, what? Like, literally maybe, right before she had to leave the locker room before the game. I kind of blurted some stuff out, but then after the game, I was able to digest it. It stung. And I remember saying, man, damn, like, this is like one of the things, like, I can't really let this go. I got to let some truthism out here. So I remember being in the locker room and reporters asking guys who were next to me, asking Paul, and literally Paul saying, look, y'all probably should ask D West that question. And I literally watched 6 or 8 reporters. I feel it, like I know they're going to kind of look. They literally look my way and walk away. And
Mm-hmm.
I learned, like, they just don't want to hear it. They don't want the perspective of an athlete that may not fit, what they want from athletes. Also in Indiana, I remember things shifted when I first got there. I was recovering from my knee surgery. So I was trying to get confidence back physically. I was trying to come into myself and those things. But I felt like once people realized, this dude's got a little bit more than just the toughness on the court, it shifted people away because they were comfortable with me being an aggressive, tough bruiser, ready to beat people up, that type of stuff. When it came to, being able to articulate certain points and then also having a view that wasn't as comforting as they'd like, you completely will get that other side where they just completely ignore you. So I experienced that personally, while I was in the NBA.
Yeah, and I think what happens with that too is you're dealing with subjects. I mean, let's face it, I refer to them as lifestyle guys on our side of the business. There are a lot of reasons why people do this. A lot of people like the lifestyle. I have not worked in an office since 1997. I've been on the road, in the airport, in the press box. That's my life. And so a lot of guys, like, you usually see this, David and Ricky, when it comes to labor. Usually when there's strike, lockout, guys are like, nah, they don't want to cover it. But post Ed O'Bannon, post Ferguson, the world's getting more and more and more complicated. Then, of course, add Kaepernick into it, it's getting more and more complicated. And it's getting more and more cross-pollinated. Like, for example, you're starting to look now and you see in the middle of a pandemic, you have a president that decides to go add commissioners to, not medical staff, but adding commissioners to the reopening committee. And so you cannot avoid this.
Right.
This cannot be avoided. The impact of sports, the influence of sports is so prevalent in the country now that you have to get involved in this whether you want to or not. And the problem is everybody knows immediately. It's almost as if you're self-programmed. There's certain lines you can't cross.
Right.
Certain you don't want to go to. I find it interesting that you had guys walking away from you on that subject on Sterling because you were the one they needed to talk to. And I remember thinking, I was talking to Carmelo about this when I was working on the Heritage, and he was telling me that there was a pretty good movement of players who really were like, we wouldn't play. And the thought of the players shutting the game down over the transgressions of an owner, I mean,
right.
You're in power structure mode right now. What was your feeling about that? Do you feel, I mean, what did you think the temperature of the players were at that time?
I knew that guys were mad. I felt the same. I had actually publicly stated, like, I didn't care if that had come from an organization that I was a part of, my season would have been done, because the language was so specific and so direct, particularly, and I'm someone who reads history. I'm aware of the cultural impact that racism and structural racism has had in the formation of these leagues.
Yeah.
And to hear him articulate it, I'm like, oh, hell no. Like, it just struck a different chord. And I think that's maybe not to that same level for other guys, but I know it struck guys in a way. And I think it gave us an opportunity to sort of measure the room, if you will, to see where that general player awareness was. And I think based on where I came in the league in 2003, and then, Sterling was maybe 2011 or 12 in that window, whatever, I felt like it had shifted and guys were a little bit more aware. The awareness had come up. And I've attributed it to social media to a large extent. Guys are on the bus, on the phone, like this, they're on the plane like this. And not everybody is, surprisingly, not everybody is just watching videos and listening to hip hop.
Yeah. I think, and it's true. I mean, I think that there's so much of this that comes to that question of who you are against who we are. Okay. You're not me. I don't get to be you, right? You've got a world-class ability that the rest of us don't have, right? I mean, how many people in this world can say, I'm the best in the world at what I do? Not that very many people can say that. So when you're looking at us as employees, it's not the same as looking at you as an employee. So you have a level of power that we don't have. And yet constantly you see the conversation, these discussions framed as, well, if I did that at my job, well, you're not me.
Right, right.
There's one LeBron James, there's one Tom Brady, there's, there aren't that many. You can't just replace those guys. You can replace me. I can get a phone call tomorrow and say, I'm going to give somebody else your job. That's the reality of our universe. It's not the reality of your universe.
Right.
But yet, when you're dealing with the public and you're dealing with media, they're applying the same frameworks. Well, why are you talking politics at work? I can't talk politics at work. We don't do the same thing. And I think, once again, Ricky, that goes back to that point earlier about the NCAA, about just completely bulldozing this entire structure at some level with the intention of re-education, with the intention of saying, listen, let's create, and maybe this post-Ferguson Kaepernick period that we're in is going to create an entirely new generation conversationally, where the athletes are expected and the athletes are respected for their opinions. But as I've said, what I see taking place over the last couple of years is a retrenchment of that, just like everything else in this country. I see people with the leagues and also in media as well, recognizing that the balance has a potential to shift, and to make sure it doesn't.